There is a story you have heard hundreds of times. The Dark Ages. Ignorance, darkness, and then an eruption. 15th century Florence. Geniuses who gaze upon nature and rediscover antiquity. Brunelleschi, Alberti, Michelangelo, Raphael. Humanity awakens. The Renaissance. Rebirth. A beautiful story, almost perfect. But there is one detail that is usually not told to you. These people did not rediscover anything. They took what was someone else's, ready, functional, alive, and rewrote it as their own. Not out of greed, not out of malice, out of the understanding that control over the past is control over the present, over who has the right to speak, to build, to think, and to make money. Look at what they left us. Domes, frescoes, sculptures, texts. Now ask one question. Where did all this come from in just one generation? There is no childhood, no mistakes, no transitional works where the artist is finding their method. There is a leap from the point of impossible to the point of masterpiece. And here the version begins to crack. We will analyze this like an engineer disassembles a machine, not by what looks good from the outside, but by what doesn't match on the inside. 4 levels at which the operation functioned. 4 types of assignment that together provide an answer to the question, what is the Renaissance really? Let's start with the simplest thing, with what you use every time you look at a painting, screen, or any image. From perspective. We are told that before Brunelleschi, artists painted incorrectly, flat, without depth. And suddenly, a jeweler came along, looked into a mirror, and art changed forever. Remember this image, a jeweler who looked into a mirror. We will return to it. You were told, linear perspective was discovered by the Florentines. Brunelleschi conducted an experiment with a mirror at the baptistry. He took a polished board, reflected the facade of the building in it, compared the reflection with reality through a hole, and noted that the lines converged at a single point. Alberti recorded the mathematics in his treatise On Painting in 1435. Masaccio painted the Trinity, and Western art was changed forever. There is one problem with this story. Brunelleschi's panels, the very boards from the experiment, have disappeared. We only know about them from a biography written 30 years after his death. The description comes from second-hand accounts, without a single drawing or physical artifact. Everything we know about Brunelleschi's experiment is a literary account by the biographer, not a technical report. And this is not the only disappearance in his work. Brunelleschi fundamentally did not leave behind any documentation on the dome. He refused to have an assistant. He removed the second architect, Ghiberti, from the project 3 years after construction began, declaring that he no longer needed him. He built in sections, conveying instructions verbally. His engineering devices, lifting mechanisms, centering devices for masonry, were dismantled after completion. There is not a single detailed technical description in his own writings. This is called the secrecy of genius. But an engineer will ask a simple question. Why would a genius, who has invented something fundamentally new, destroy their blueprints? If you are a pioneer, you keep the documentation. If you have adapted someone else's work, you get rid of it. Okay, then open any 11th century optics textbook. Not Italian, Arabic. Ibn al-Haytham, a scholar from Basra, known in Europe as Al-Hazen, wrote the Book of Optics in the year 1021, 400 years before Alberti. He described the visual pyramid, a mathematical model of how rays from an object converge at the point of the eye. He identified 22 characteristics of vision that the intellect interprets through the eye: size, distance, shape, position. He described the camera obscura. He constructed a complete geometry of what Alberti would later call the artist's window. And this is not a hypothesis. The Latin translation of Alhazen was available in Europe since the 13th century. It was studied by Roger Bacon and Vitello. It sat on the shelves of the very monasteries and universities where the humanists were educated. Now add one more observation to this. Vitruvius, the Roman architect of the 1st century BC, whose treatise 10 Books on Architecture became a handbook of the Renaissance, described the principles of constructing stage sets with consideration for optical effects. He wrote that certain lines in a drawing should create the illusion of depth. This text lay in the same monasteries, the very dungeons of Poggio. Cathedral builders made use of it. And still, the invention of perspective is attributed to the 15th century, the year 1425. Flawless architectural perspective. The vanishing point. Everything converges in one point at the viewer's eye level. Mathematically precise. And between the flat medieval icons and this fresco, there's not a single transitional step. No academic works showcasing the childhood of the style. No intermediate artist who tried and failed. Technology cannot emerge fully mature right away. That doesn't happen. It only occurs when a ready-made system is adopted. At first glance, it seems that artists have simply learned to look at nature. This is the most convenient explanation. But here's the problem. Perspective is not what you see with your eyes. A person sees with two eyes, binocularly, and the brain constantly corrects the image. That mathematical perspective depicted in paintings is an abstraction that contradicts real vision. It cannot be derived from observation. It must be obtained as a ready-made algorithm. Albert received it. From where? Textbooks prefer not to specify. There is one more detail that is often overlooked. The famous window of Alberti, a metaphor of the canvas as a transparent plane through which the artist looks at the world, is an accurate description of the camera obscura, the very same one that Alhazen detailed 4 centuries before him. A dark room with a hole through which light projects an inverted image of the outside world onto the opposite wall. The principle is the same. The words are different. The name is different. Many will now say, so what? Rediscoveries in science happen. One idea can arise twice independently. Okay, then explain this. Alberti was familiar with the Franciscan optical tradition through Roger Bacon. Bacon is a direct reader of Alhazen. The chain is unbroken. This is not an independent discovery. It is a translation with a change of name on the cover. Why is Alberti called the father of perspective when Alhazen fully described the geometry of the visual cone 4 centuries earlier? This is not a trivial question. It is a matter of who has the right to be called the author. And it leads to the next one. If perspective was assigned as an intellectual tool, then why couldn't the same happen with texts, with physical objects, with the biographies of artists? Why settle for one tool when the system is working? Look at that very dome, the main symbol of the Renaissance, Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. Its diameter is 45.5 meters. It was constructed without external scaffolding or buttresses, which were considered the only way to build large vaults in Europe. Brunelleschi, that very jeweler, won the competition in 1418 and built what had been deemed an impossible task for 140 years. The official version: he studied the Pantheon in Rome and cracked the code of the ancients. He returned with an understanding of the principle of the dome. He invented the herringbone bricklaying, which allows the bricks to support themselves during construction without any bottom supports. This version has a problem. The Pantheon is made of monolithic concrete. Pouring concrete and laying bricks are fundamentally different technologies. It is impossible to derive a system of self-supporting brick masonry from the study of the Pantheon. These are different materials with different mechanics. Then where does the little tree come from? Find the mausoleum of Olyetu in Sultania, Iran, 1310 AD, 110 years before Brunelleschi. A double-shell dome, self-supporting brickwork. The diameter of the dome exceeds 24 meters. Everything that is considered Brunelleschi's invention had already been realized. In Persia, a century before him, the Florentine guilds traded with the East. The wool weavers' guild, Arte della Lana, the very one that financed the construction of the cathedral, had commercial connections through Levantine trade routes. Eastern artisans, Eastern technologies, Eastern patterns. All of this flowed through the same channels as silk and spices. Brunelleschi left no blueprints for the dome. He worked without documentation, conveying instructions to the masters verbally and in pieces. This was presented as the creative secrecy of genius. But there is another explanation. If the technology was borrowed, documenting its source is undesirable. His machines for lifting materials, later sketched by Leonardo da Vinci in the Atlantic Codex, appear as advanced versions of standard workshop mechanisms. They were also declared personal inventions of the genius. A jeweler who looked in the mirror and invented perspective. A jeweler who studied the ruins and invented a brick dome without scaffolding. One person, two discoveries in one decade. Both without intermediate steps, both without documentation, both with clear precedents outside of Europe. This is not an accusation. This is an observation. The pattern is too recognizable. Poggio Bracciolini is one of the main characters in the story of the rescue of antiquity. The secretary to the Pope, an educated man and a master of Latin prose. From 1414 to 1418, he traveled through the monasteries of Switzerland, Germany, and France, and he found Quintilian in St. Gallen, Lucretius in Fulda, Vitruvius in Cluny. In his letters, the monasteries are described as dungeons, foul basements, where ignorant monks keep the great authors of antiquity in captivity. Beautifully written, and that is precisely why it is worth taking a moment to pause. Look at what he describes himself. Quintilian in St. Gall was, I quote Poggio verbatim, whole and unharmed, not buried in dirt, not eaten by worms, whole. The monastery library maintained catalogs. The text was used in teaching. Dungeon is a literary device, not a description of the actual condition of the archive. Then why was it needed? Poggio immediately rewrote the found texts in a new handwriting. He didn't copy them, he rewrote them, changing their appearance. This was called humanistic minuscule, beautiful, rounded, with an antique look. It was done specifically to visually detach the text from Gothic script, the handwriting of the monks who had preserved these texts. The same text by Vitruvius in Gothic type looked like a monastic copy. The same text in Antiqua appeared as a direct messenger from Rome. The font didn't alter the content, it changed the origin. And many originals disappeared immediately after Poggio made his copy. No traces were left. Only his version remained. Now look at this from another perspective. In the monasteries of Europe during the 15th century, there were several thousand manuscripts of ancient authors. They were copied, used in theological curricula, and referenced. The monastic school in St. Gall was one of the best in Europe. No oblivion or dungeon. Look, if the monks did not value these texts, why did they preserve them? Why did they copy them? Why did they spend on parchment, which was expensive? If the monks valued them, then the idea of imprisonment is a lie. The choice is simple. The monks were either guardians or jailers. Poggio chose the second version, because the first left him with the role of merely a copyist, not a savior. Among the found texts of Poggio, Lucretius's On the Nature of Things deserves special attention. This poem from the 1st century BC presents atomism, a materialistic view of the world without gods, providence, or an afterlife. For the Church, this was a dangerous text. Monks copied it. There was a tradition among them to preserve everything written in Latin, even works with which they disagreed. Humanists discovered it and transformed it into the philosophical foundation of a new worldview. Poggio found Lucretius in the year 1417. Half a century later, Epicurean and atomistic philosophy was actively discussed among the Medici circles. This is no coincidence, it's a strategy. Antiquity was selectively chosen and rescued. What was needed for the new ideology emerged. What hindered it remained in the dungeon. Manuscripts were part of the vibrant monastic culture. Monks copied them, taught from them, and debated over them. Humanists declared them dead to assert their exclusive right to resurrect them. Whoever resurrected them became their owner. In the year 1422, a certain Piero Lambertesi offered Poggio 500 florins, a colossal sum, for the writing of a book in Hungary, under conditions of strict secrecy. What exactly needed to be written is not specified in the documents, but a version arises by itself. Some of the found texts may not have been found at all, but rather compiled. Assembled from fragments, completed upon request, packaged in the correct font. In 4 years, from 1414 to 1418, Poggio discovered almost all the major Latin texts that later formed the foundation of humanist education. Quintilian, Lucretius, Vitruvius, Silius Italicus, Manilius, Cicero, several new speeches. This is either a phenomenal stroke of luck or phenomenal organization. In 4 years, one person finds what monks allegedly could not find in hundreds of years. This is an unproven fact. It's a question that official history prefers not to ask. And here it is important to take a step back. Look at the font that Poggio used to transcribe the found texts. It is called Humanistic Minuscule. Poggio developed it specifically and proclaimed it to be a restored ancient writing, the true Latin that was used in the times of Cicero. That's not true. Compare this font with authentic Latin manuscripts from the 1st and 2nd centuries. They were written quite differently, in capital letters or in uncials. The Humanist Minuscule is a revised Carolingian minuscule from the 9th century. It was created by monks under Charlemagne to standardize documentation in his empire. Monastic administrative writing. which Poggio took, rounded off a bit, and declared it ancient. Gothic is the font of the monkish keepers. Antiqua is the font of the humanist discoverers. The reader saw antique writing on the page and thought of Rome, not of the 9th century monastery of Corby, where this font was developed. Among the manuscripts that Poggio discovered are Tacitus' Annals, the main source on the history of the early Roman Empire. Tacitus describes the era of Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. It is this text that underpins our understanding of the 1st century AD. The manuscript appeared in the monastery of Corvey and entered circulation precisely through Poggio's circle. Swiss scholar John Wilson Ross proposed a theory in the 19th century, marginal but never definitively disproven, that Tacitus' Annals were written by Poggio himself. He compared styles and found similarities with other texts by Poggio. Most historians have dismissed this theory. However, the mere existence of such a question speaks volumes about the depth of the operation. Here's what matters for the overall picture. Tacitus is not just history. Tacitus represents the image of bad emperors and good republicans. It is a political rhetoric upon which all critics of absolute power in Europe in the following centuries relied. Cicero is a model of rhetorical prose and republican values. Lucretius provides the philosophical foundation for materialism. Vitruvius is an authority in architecture. Quintilian is the basis of pedagogy. It is no coincidence that these texts were found. Each of them addressed a specific ideological task for the new class: urban intellectuals, independent from the church hierarchy, relying on the authority of the ancients instead of the authority of Scripture. Monks copied them, taught from them, and debated over them. Humanists declared them dead in order to assert their exclusive right to resurrection. Whoever resurrected them became their owner. That's why the monks were so reluctant to part with the texts. If you preserve a living tradition, you hold authority. If you are a warden of dead heritage, you are nobody. Poggio was not just collecting manuscripts. He was redefining who has the right to claim antiquity. But that was only the intellectual level. At the level of physical objects, the story became even more captivating. In 1506, a sculpture was found in a Roman vineyard, Laocoon with his 2 sons. Pliny the Elder described it as the greatest work of sculpture of all time. Pope Julius II immediately purchased it and sent it to the Vatican. Bramante looked at it and said, "This surpasses everything I have ever seen." Michelangelo came to see it the very next day. The sculpture was incomplete. Neither the father nor any of the sons had a right arm. Bramante organized a competition for the restoration. The best sculptors of Rome were tasked with guessing how the original hands looked. The version by Montorsoli, a student of Michelangelo, won. Laocoon's hand was raised upward in an ecstatic, pathetic, almost theatrical gesture. It was precisely what appealed to the taste of the 16th century. It was that pose which dictated the style of the Baroque for the next century and a half. Michelangelo protested. He said that the arm should be bent, pressed against the body. He was ignored. This Laocoon, with the incorrect arm, stood in the Vatican for 400 years. It was studied, copied, and served as a foundation for theories on pathos and the sublime. Goethe wrote about it as a benchmark for depicting human suffering. Lessing wrote an entire treatise titled Laocoon, in which he analyzed this particular image with the outstretched arm as a model for all visual art in Europe. Count the generations of artists who copied this sculpture in academies. Each drawing, each cast, each plaster model reproduced the Renaissance restoration. Not the original, the restoration. In 1905, a fragment was found in construction debris, the original hand of Laocoon. It was bent, just as Michelangelo had said. 4 centuries of academic education were built on the Renaissance version, not the original. Historians usually refer to this as the mistake of the restorers. Okay, but then answer this. Why, in the 18th century, when doubts about Montorsoli's version had already arisen, wasn't it revised? Why was it defended? Why did Laocoon, with the correct outstretched arm, continue to be replicated in casts and textbooks, even though alternative versions existed? Because by that time, this version had become part of the system. It confirmed the theory. It was needed that way. Look at the logic. First, restoration is done with an outstretched hand. Then, based on this restoration, a theory of the pathetic sublime is constructed, determining how a depiction of a person in extreme suffering should look. After that, the theory begins to defend the restoration, because if the hand is bent, the entire theory collapses. The circle is complete. This is not a unique case. It is standard mechanics. The object is being edited. A theory is built on the edited object. The theory defends the editing. That is precisely why the history of art re-examines restoration mistakes so slowly. Not out of laziness, but because each such mistake is embedded in the theoretical system. Removing an error means dismantling a part of the system. And this is not the only editing of ancient sculpture. You have all seen the white marble statues of gods, athletes, emperors. Perfect whiteness, cold marble. That's not true. Ancient statues were colorful, bright, painted in red, blue, gold. Traces of color can still be found today, if you know where to look. Ultraviolet light reveals pigments where the eye sees only marble. Take the Pergamon altar, or the famous sculpture Peplos Kore from the Museum of Athens. When illuminated with ultraviolet light, traces of red paint appear on the clothing, blue on the borders, and black on the hair. This is not an exception. It is the norm. Almost every public sculpture in Greece and Rome was painted. Renaissance restorers cleaned sculptures with alkaline solutions to achieve perfect whiteness. They created a different antiquity, cold, monumental, austere, the one that better suited the new canon, a model from which it was easier to detach by adding life and color in Renaissance works. The myth of the white classical style is a technological artifact of the 16th century. It is not a historical reality. And this mistake has been solidified for centuries. In the 18th century, German art historian Johann Winckelmann wrote the foundational History of Ancient Art, the main theoretical text of neoclassicism. His description of ancient beauty was based on the white sculptures he observed in Italian collections. Noble simplicity, and quiet grandeur, refers to white marble devoid of color. When Goethe, Schiller, and Canova constructed the image of ideal classicism, they built it on a Renaissance edition taken as the original. 3 centuries of the European ideal of beauty relied on an artifact of alkaline solution. Alongside the alterations of the objects, the history of their creation was also reinterpreted. Giorgio Vasari, the first art historian, wrote Lives of the Artists in 1550. It remains the primary source on the Renaissance to this day. His version is that Italian artists liberated themselves from the crude Greek manner and returned to nature. The Renaissance is a purely Florentine miracle. But the Lives of the Artists has a structural feature that is usually overlooked. Vasari works for Duke Cosimo de' Medici. Most of his main subjects are artists from Florence or closely connected to it. His book is a publishing product created for a specific patron with a specific political function: to establish Florence as the center of world culture. When the Dutch artist Jan van Eyck developed oil painting in the 1420s, providing an unprecedented depth of color, Vasari wrote that the technique was brought to Italy by Antonello da Messina, an Italian, not a Dutchman. It is noteworthy that Vasari himself writes in this very text, Cimabue, the first Renaissance artist, learned from Byzantine masters, specifically invited to Florence for the restoration of the art of painting, not out of desire, but because there were no local masters. Then Vasari performs a logical somersault. Cimabue surpassed his teachers simply by looking at nature. That's it. The teachers can be forgotten. Their role is over. You may leave. Look at the frescoes in Nerezi, Macedonia, 1064th year. The scene of mourning. Weeping Mary presses her face to the face of her Son. The apostles with broken postures, with lively, psychologically accurate faces. That very breakthrough to humanity that we have come to consider the invention of Giotto. The non-raised was written 130 years before Giotto. The same emotional truth, the same vividness of the depiction of grief, only without the Florentine brand. And this is not the only example. The frescoes in Curbino in Macedonia, the year 1191. The church in Bashkovo in Bulgaria. The mosaics of the Chora Monastery in Constantinople. Across the Orthodox world, starting from the 12th century, living faces, dynamic poses, psychological accuracy. Everything that the Renaissance declared its discovery. The Italians did not discover psychological depth in painting. They imported it, repainted it, and renamed it. There is another artist whom Vasari overlooks, Theophanes the Greek. He arrived in Russia from Constantinople in the late 14th century. His frescoes in the Novgorod Church of the Transfiguration from the year 1378 are dynamic, expressive, with a characteristic light-bearing technique of white highlights that create an effect of spiritual radiance. His pupil, Andrei Rublev, created the Trinity, one of the most perfect works in the history of painting, in the 1410s, without any contact with the Florentine Renaissance. If brilliant painting existed in Novgorod and Moscow at the same time as in Florence, and without Florentine influence, then it is not about a unique discovery. It is about the fact that a living tradition of artistic mastery existed simultaneously in several places. The Florentines simply knew how to sell it better. The Basilica of San Marco is literally assembled from pieces of Constantinople, taken after the sacking of 1204. The 4 bronze horses above the entrance are from Constantinople. They stood in the hippodrome of Constantinople since the 4th century. The columns inside are from Constantinople. The enamels, mosaics, architectural details, everything is from there. The Venetians did not revive antiquity. They physically exported it and integrated it into a new building. And the most interesting thing is, the Gates of Paradise by Ghiberti, the very bronze door of the Florence baptistery, which Michelangelo called worthy to be the Gates of Paradise, is technically impossible without centuries of tradition in artistic bronze casting. That same tradition that existed in Byzantium, which was later declared reborn in Europe. Note another fact that is often overlooked. The surface of the Gates of Paradise features 10 panels depicting biblical scenes in a relief technique with perspective. A multi-layered relief where the figures in the foreground are larger than those in the background, creating an illusion of depth. This is precisely what was referred to as Ghiberti's innovation. However, the same technique, relief with multi-layered perspective, has been known in Islamic metal art since the 10th century. Dishes, trays, mosque doors. The same principle is present everywhere. Florence was actively trading with the Arab and Persian worlds through Genoese and Venetian intermediaries. Eastern metalworks were collector's items in wealthy households. Ghiberti saw them. And here lies the main discrepancy of the official version. The Renaissance flourishes precisely when refugees from Constantinople flood into Italy, after its capture in 1453. Scholars, craftsmen, artists, manuscripts, tools. Ready technologies that have nowhere to go and no one to sell them to, except for Italian patrons. This is called an external push to flourish. Historians acknowledge this cautiously. But the question that is not asked, was the Renaissance an awakening, or was it absorption? Count. The year 1453. Constantinople is captured. 1459. Cosimo de' Medici establishes the Platonic Academy in Florence. The main intellectual there becomes Georgios Gemistos Plethon, a Greek scholar from Constantinople who fled to the west. He brought not just manuscripts of Plato, he brought a living tradition of Neoplatonic philosophy, which had existed continuously in the Orthodox world since the 4th century. In the West, it was declared a revival of Platonism. In reality, it was a transplantation of an active tradition. Now, about the object, which has an even more interesting history. Belvedere torso. A fragment without a head, without arms, without legs. Just a torso. Twisted, powerful, with an incredible relief of muscles. In the collection of the Colonna family since the 1430s. According to legend, Michelangelo refused to restore it. He said he did not want to touch the perfect teacher. And this is true, in the sense that the torso truly became his teacher. Look at Adam in the Sistine Chapel, at Christ in the Last Judgment, at the figures in the Battle of Cascina, which survives only in copies. It is the same torso, only expanded into space, endowed with arms and integrated into a narrative. Michelangelo did not restore the torso. He absorbed it, made it his own signature. But here's what's strange. For decades before Michelangelo, this object lay undisturbed in the collection. It was unnoticed. It was only recognized when the demand arose for a powerful, muscular sculpture. That's when the greatest Greek fragment emerged. On the torso, there is an inscription, Apollonios, son of Nestor. It's beautiful and authoritative. However, this name does not appear in any known ancient lists of masters, neither in Pliny, nor in Pausanias, nor in other sources. Nowhere. What has given rise to the theory, unproven yet also not dismissed, that the object may have been created or significantly altered specifically in the 15th century, in response to the request for a genius Greek fragment. There is one more detail. The exaggerated musculature of the torso is not realistic anatomy. Greek classical sculpture favored ideal proportions over hypertrophied muscles. However, the exaggerated musculature is a personal style of Michelangelo. It is his signature, his vision. The perfect teacher turned out to be an exact replica of the aesthetics of his student. Consider this principle. The past was altered not by chance. It was transformed to suit the tastes of the client. And then the client declared the revised version as the original. This is also evident in another famous case, less scandalous, but no less indicative. The Apollo Belvedere, a statue that became the standard of male beauty for several generations. When it was found, it also had no arms. Renaissance restorers added one, an arm extended forward, a commanding, authoritative gesture. This is the image of Apollo that was reproduced in academies all over Europe. It wasn't until the 20th century that serious debates began about whether the pose had been reconstructed correctly. But by that time, the Apollo with the outstretched arm had already become a canon. As for Laocoon, there is another detail that is usually overlooked. Pliny the Elder solemnly asserted that the group was carved from a single block of marble. This was part of the description of it as a masterpiece, from a single stone. When the sculpture was assembled and studied, it turned out to be made up of several pieces, 7 fragments. Pliny was either mistaken or saw a different object. This means that even the basic primary description of what the Florentines discovered does not match what they found. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, patron of the arts, defender of antiquity, engraved his name deep into the bodies of ancient objects. lau.r.med. Laurentius Medicius. On vases, on cameos, on gemstones, on vessels over 1,000 and 2,000 years old, including the Farnese cup, a sardonyx cup from the 2nd century BC. This is one of the most technically complex carved objects to have survived from antiquity. Several layers of semi-precious stone, where the figures are in white and the background is in brown. Reproducing such a work in the 15th century was virtually impossible. This cup bears the imprint of a banker, deeply, forever. The inventory of the year 1492, after the death of Lorenzo, shows that hundreds of ancient objects were legally secured to the family through this physical intervention. Not preserved for posterity, appropriated, with markings. Lorenzo's main supplier was a certain Giovanni Ciampolini, a dealer known for illegal excavations and smuggling from Rome. These are not rumors. They are in the documents. It is officially referred to as great patronage. If you think that engraving your name on a millennia-old object is an act of love for art, then ask yourself one question. Why couldn't it have just been labeled? Why the irreversible physical act? Because a mark signifies ownership, visible, undeniable, outlasting the owner. Lorenzo collected busts of Hadrian, Augustus, and Agrippa. They stood in one hall alongside portraits of the Medici. A guest entering the hall would inevitably see this: a banking family in the same visual line as Roman emperors. Not metaphorically, literally, in the space of one room. The Garden of San Marco was the first academy in Europe, a place where the Medici allowed young artists to study ancient models. It was a closed territory. Access to antiquity was given in portions, in exchange for loyalty. If you want to learn from the greats, you must be indebted to the family. Control over the models is control over the language of art. And the language of art is a subtle yet very strong power. Control over the past meant control over the future. This was understood by everyone who played this game. There is a figure that is usually not mentioned. By the year 1500, the Medici collection included around 300 ancient coins, several hundred cameos and gems, and about 70 busts and statues. This is the largest private collection of ancient objects in Europe. The value is colossal. Each object bears the name lau.r.med inside. Each object is a guarantee of access to it only through the family. When Lorenzo passed away, his son Piero couldn't cope. The Medici were expelled from Florence in 1494. The collection was partially scattered. Some objects ended up on the market. Some were given to other palaces. Some of them are now in museums around the world as anonymous ancient works, with painted over or removed inscriptions, or with stamps that simply no one is looking for. Around the year 1480, several young artists disappeared without a trace in Rome. Literally, the ground gave way beneath their feet, and they found themselves in underground halls. These were the ruins of Nero's golden house, the Domus Aurea. Nero, a man whom Roman tradition regarded as a tyrant, a madman, a persecutor of Christians. His palace occupied 120 hectares in the center of Rome. After his death, the palace was deliberately buried, built over, and efforts were made to erase it from memory. It was a political operation against his legacy. Raphael and Giovanni of Udine descended there on ropes by torchlight. Lying on their backs, they copied the frescoes directly onto the walls. Figures, ornaments, intertwining plants and animals, fantastic scenes. This style was immediately dubbed grotesque, from the word grotto, cave, and it swiftly became the official decor of the Vatican. The Raphael loggias in the Papal Palace are adorned with a direct transplant of painting from Nero's palace. The style of a man whom the Church officially regarded as the principal persecutor of the early Christians became the style of the Church itself. Historians say that artists simply took beautiful ornamentation without paying attention to the source. If you think this is the case, then why has no one pointed out this contradiction? Why did no papal advisor say, "Wait, we are decorating holy halls with paintings from Nero's house"? Because something else mattered to them. The style worked. It looked antique. And who originally owned those walls could be forgotten. The title Grotesques erased the source. The viewer saw the elegant ornamentation. They did not see whose walls stood behind it. This is the mechanics of renaming. You take someone else's work, you call it something different. The origin disappears. Only your authority remains. There's another aspect of this story that is usually not mentioned. The Domus Aurea was buried. This is well documented. But it was not buried for the sake of destruction. The baths of Trajan were built on its ceilings. The frescoed halls were used as storage, as a foundation for new constructions. People walked over these ceilings for centuries, unaware of what lay beneath them. When Raphael and his circle discovered these halls, they did not simply find beautiful images. They found a technique. Specifically, the technique of painting with thin pigments on wet plaster in enclosed spaces, which provided a certain brightness and durability of color. This technique later manifested in Raphael's works, in the loggias, in individual frescoes. They did not merely copy the ornamentation, they studied the technological approach. The humanist minuscule, that beautiful rounded font used in all classical manuscripts of the Renaissance, was created in the circle of Poggio Bracciolini at the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries. It was declared a return to the purity of ancient writing, a direct link to Rome. Reality. This is a rewritten Carolingian minuscule from the 9th century, a font introduced during the reforms of Charlemagne for the unification of correspondence throughout the Frankish Empire. A monastic font. Medieval. Not ancient, just renamed. The goal was clear. Gothic is the font of the monks who preserved the texts. Antiqua is the font of the humanists who discovered them. The same Vitruvius in Gothic looks like a monastic copy. The same text in Antiqua appears as a direct messenger from Rome. The font became a weapon in the debate over authority. One tool, the way letters are rendered, not only allowed for the rewriting of text, but also for the appropriation of its origins. The difference in writing transformed into a difference in authority. Not who preserved, but who returned. Not a monk in St. Gall, but a humanist in Florence. Note, it was this renaming that was later immortalized by the printing press. When Gutenberg created movable type, he used Gothic because it was the familiar font for the German reader. However, Italian printers, working in the tradition of humanists, switched to the Antiqua typeface. And when the classics, Cicero, Virgil, Vitruvius, began to be printed across Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, they were printed in Antiqua, in the ancient typeface. As a result, entire generations of readers received ancient texts in a typeface that visually communicated, "This is a direct connection to Rome." The Carolingian Middle Ages were completely obscured behind this visual code. The reader did not think of the 9th century monastery of Corbie. He thought of 1st century Rome. Look at how the picture comes together. The mathematics of vision has been taken from an Arab scholar and repackaged in the Florentine discovery. Monastic manuscripts have been rewritten in a new font and declared returned from captivity. Ancient sculptures have been reworked to suit the tastes of the era. Laocoon's hand, color removed. Byzantine psychological insight has been absorbed and renamed Italian style. Ancient objects have been branded with the names of bankers. The style of Nero's palace has become the ornamentation of papal halls. The medieval font has been renamed ancient. Each of these acts separately is minor, explicable, almost innocent. A restorer's mistake, the enthusiasm of a bibliophile, a collector's love. Together, however, they form a system, a recurring pattern operating on the same logic. Find, adapt, rename, appropriate authority. But the system operated on yet another level, one that is the hardest to notice, at the level of production itself in antiquity. Piero Ligorio, architect, antiquarian, creator of the Villa d'Este in Tivoli, was one of the most respected authorities on antiquity in the 16th century. Popes and cardinals paid him for his expertise in the identification of ancient objects and inscriptions. In the 19th century, the German historian Theodor Mommsen began to systematize all known Latin inscriptions. A colossal project, the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, a sort of complete catalog of ancient Roman epigraphy. And he discovered something very inconvenient. Several thousand inscriptions from the largest collections in Europe were forgeries. Mommsen created a special section in his catalog, Falsae Ligurianae, the forgeries of Ligorio. Ligorio did not study antiquity. He reconstructed it. He invented names, titles, entire biographies of people who had never existed. He discovered stones that confirmed the nobility of specific families who paid for the expertise. He crafted inscriptions that legalized land ownership rights. One forged stone could be worth more than a genuine archival document because it was older than any archive and could not be challenged in court. Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, for whom Ligorio built a villa in Tivoli, generously paid for inscriptions that connected the territory with ancient Roman history. Land with a proven ancient tradition was valued differently than just regular land. A legal document can be contested in court, but who can contest a stone with a Latin inscription? Remember the scale. Out of 180,000 Latin inscriptions included in Mommsen's catalog, thousands ended up in a special section for forgeries, and most of them are the work of a single person from the 16th century. Visit any major European museum. Find the section with Latin inscriptions. Among them is Ligurianae. They are still there. Some are labeled, while others are not yet. Historians refer to Ligorio as a dishonest antiquarian and say that he is an exception. But here's the question. If one person, over several decades, was able to create thousands of forgeries indistinguishable from the original and introduce them into the largest collections in Europe, what does this say about the level of expertise of that time? About the system that accepted these objects as genuine? This indicates that authenticity in the 16th century was not a scientific concept. It was a matter of reputation and networks of trust. If a respected individual declared an object to be ancient, then it was considered ancient, because everyone else lacked the means to verify otherwise. How much of what we call historical evidence about antiquity was actually written in the 16th century? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a working scientific problem that professional epigraphers are still addressing. Now stop and look at the entire structure as a whole. Physical level. Ancient stones, columns, capitals are extracted from the ruins and incorporated into new buildings. Rome functions as a quarry. The Cancelleria Palace incorporates 44 granite columns from ancient baths, simply taken out and repositioned. Bramante's Tempietto, widely regarded as a masterpiece of the High Renaissance, is built entirely from spolia. Pope Alexander VI called himself the restorer of antiquity, although his main activity was the dismantling of ancient forums to adorn the Vatican. This is not reverence for ancient stones. This is a reduction in construction costs by 5 times. Savings, which were referred to as the spirit of continuity. One contractor removed materials from the Colosseum using 2,500 carts for a single contract. This is documented. Over several decades in the 15th century, the Roman Forum was dismantled almost to the foundation. Many ancient columns in Renaissance buildings are not properly matched in scale. Capitals of different orders and sizes are aligned with shims. They took what was available. A chaotic assortment of construction debris, presented as continuity with Rome. And here arises a question that is usually asked in a different context. What if, beneath this layer of appropriation, there is another one? Spolia are stones from one ruin. But there is evidence that beneath several Renaissance buildings in Rome lie significantly older structures that were not dismantled for bricks, but were integrated whole. Foundations, basements, entire floors, buried or rebuilt over. This is a separate topic, but it follows the same logic. What if we consider the volumes and ask the question, who, why, and how quickly did this happen? Intellectual level. Arab optical schemes and monastic texts acquire the names of Florentines. Ready knowledge is repackaged into discoveries. Alhazen's mathematics becomes Alberti's insight. Persian anatomy turns into Vesalius's atlas. The name on the cover is not authorship. It is a brand. Another important mechanism is the mechanism of translation. When an Arabic or Persian text was translated into Latin, the translator inevitably added their own interpretations. They removed what seemed incomprehensible or unnecessary. They adapted terms. By the third or fourth translation, the text could differ significantly from the original. Then, a humanist, working with this translation, would correct it again and publish it as a purified ancient author. By that time, the original source had passed through 3 levels of intermediaries. Visual level. Artifacts are edited to fit a desired image. Statues are given correct hands. Color is washed off them. Objects without documented histories are given names that do not appear in sources. Symbolic level. Stamps, fonts, academies. Who has access to ancient specimens? Who is called the father of a certain invention? Who stands next to imperial busts in the same hall? Add one more thing to this. Latin in the 15th century was the working language of educated Europe. Humanists reformed it. They separated classical Latin of Cicero from barbaric medieval Latin. Again, the same pattern. One was declared authentic, the other corrupted. As a result, the monastic texts written in medieval Latin came to be seen as secondary compared to the humanist reprints of classical authors. Although the content was the same, the language was different. Authority resided with those who controlled the correct language. 4 levels. None are random. Together, this is not rebirth. It is a corporate takeover of cultural heritage. But there is another element that is usually described separately, although it is part of the same system. Academies. The Platonic Academy of the Medici. The Academy of Fine Arts was founded later, but based on the same model. Exclusive institutions where true knowledge of antiquity was controlled. Membership was by invitation only. Access to examples was granted through patronage. If you wanted to study the best ancient sculptures, you needed entry to the Garden of San Marco. Entry was through loyalty to the Medici. Young Michelangelo gained access to the garden through a personal acquaintance with Lorenzo. Lorenzo noticed him, invited him to live in his home, and provided him with resources. In return, absolute loyalty. The first major commissions, the first connections. This is not patronage in the modern sense of the word. It is vertical integration. The Medici controlled the raw materials, the classical samples. They controlled access to education. They controlled the first clients. They controlled whose name resonated in academic circles and whose did not. An artist, without their approval, could be a genius and remain unseen. There's another case that is usually presented as a story of scientific progress. But looking at it from a different perspective, it's essentially the same story. Andreas Vesalius, year 1543. On the Structure of the Human Body, an atlas of anatomy that changed medicine. Hyper-realistic images of skeletons, muscles, and organs. Impeccable, precise, artistically flawless. The figures are depicted against the backdrop of Tuscan landscapes, in poses that echo classical sculpture. 5 years prior, in 1538, Vesalius published 6 tables, still containing the gross errors of Galen. The very same errors that had been repeated in medical texts for 1400 years. 5 years. A leap from medieval maps to a modern atlas. Historians say Vesalius began to dissect corpses on his own rather than read Galen. A revolution in method. Okay, but consider this. In 5 years of practical anatomy, one can accumulate quite a lot. But creating a systematic atlas where each muscle, each vessel, each nerve is depicted accurately and consistently, that's a different scale of work. This is not just one person with a scalpel. This is production. Here is what is usually not mentioned. The Persian anatomist Mansur ibn Ilyas, in the year 1390, 150 years before Vesalius, created full-page diagrams of the systems of the skeleton, muscles, and vessels. Detailed, systematic. It is this architecture of diagrams, one organ, the entire system, that underlies the structure of Vesalius's atlas. The Arab scholar Ibn al-Nafis described the pulmonary circulation in the 13th century, how blood from the right ventricle flows to the lungs rather than through the septum of the heart, as Galen believed. This was 3 centuries before European doctors discovered it. Vesalius described the same in De Fabrica. Vesalius worked as an editor of Latin translations of Arabic medical treatises before the publication of his atlas. This is not a hypothesis. It is a biographical fact recorded in publishing records. The illustrations in De Fabrica were not created by Vesalius himself. They were produced by a professional workshop, presumably connected to the circle of Titian. Jan Stefan van Kalkar, a Flemish artist who worked in Venice, was responsible for them. This was a commercial publishing project. The Venetian printing house of Oporino published the atlas in a print run that no Persian or Arabic original had ever matched. The print run determined everything. It wasn't about who knew first, but rather who printed more. Vesalius, brand. And here's what's interesting. In the same year of 1543, the Spanish physician Miguel Servet independently described the same small circle of blood circulation as Ibn al-Nafis had 3 centuries earlier. 2 Europeans discovered the same thing in 1 year, because both were working with Arabic medical treatises through the same channels of translation. But their fates diverged. Vesalius is a name in textbooks. Servet was burned at the stake in Geneva on charges of heresy. His anatomical discovery was found in a text that the Inquisition deemed blasphemous. The same knowledge. One received recognition, the other faced the pyre. This is not a coincidence. It's a matter of packaging. But here the most uncomfortable question arises. These people, Poggio, Alberti, Medici, Raphael, were smart, often brilliantly so. They were not fraudsters in the primitive sense. So why? Look at what was happening around. The end of the 14th century, the beginning of the 15th century, the great Western schism of the Church. 3 popes simultaneously, each excommunicating the others. Authority is collapsing. The trading republics are wealthy, but wealth without symbolic authority does not equal power. The Medici bankers finance the popes, but who exactly finances the popes is not publicly disclosed. And here appears a convenient construct. Not the Church, not God, but antiquity. Rome, Greece, an authority that is above any living institution because it is eternal. It cannot be excommunicated from the Church. It cannot be politically contested. The past as the supreme judge of the present. Whoever controls access to this past controls authority. Not through military might, not through lineage, but through knowledge, beauty, authenticity. This is why the Medici engraved their name on objects. This is why Poggio rewrote manuscripts in a new style. This is why Ligorio created thousands of fake inscriptions. Not out of greed, but from a rational understanding. In an era when old sources of legitimacy have collapsed, he who writes the past writes the future. Notice yet another pattern. Many discoveries of the era occurred at moments of acute political demand. Vitruvius's treatise on architecture was found precisely when Rome was embarking on a large-scale reconstruction. Frontinus's treatise on aqueducts emerged when the city needed a new water supply system. The Laocoon appeared exactly at the time when Julius II was seeking a great ancient precedent for his monumental commissions. Coincidences? Perhaps. But the chain is too long to be random. There is one more example that usually does not make it onto this list. Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture was discovered and has been reprinted numerous times. Yet no one asks why the text mentions materials and techniques that were atypical in the 1st century BC, but quite typical in the late Middle Ages. Architectural researchers have been pointing out these inconsistencies since the 19th century. There is no answer. The archival thread breaks off where the manuscript fell into the hands of humanists. Look at Cosimo de' Medici, Lorenzo's grandfather. He was the one who founded the Platonic Academy in Florence in 1458. The main intellectual of the academy became Marsilio Ficino, the son of his personal physician. Cosimo provided him with manuscripts, housing, and money. Ficino translated Plato, Plotinus, and Hermes Trismegistus. He created a theology that reconciled paganism with Christianity, an ideal intellectual product for the class of wealthy merchants who needed philosophy without monastic self-denial. The academy was a closed club. Membership was by invitation only. Knowledge was dosed. Texts were translated under supervision. This was not just patronage. It was the production of ideology. And Cosimo controlled the entire production chain, from manuscript to translation to audience. One illustrative fact. Ficino was assigned first to translate the Corpus Hermeticum, Greek texts attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus, and only then to move on to Plato, although Plato was theologically more significant. This was because the Corpus Hermeticum provided astrological and magical legitimization of power, exactly what the Medici needed here and now. Cosimo distributed translations like a production plan. Priority was given according to demand. This is not a conspiracy. It is competitive logic. Whoever controls the authoritative past controls the present, without an army, without a lineage. Through text, through example, through a name on the cover. The Renaissance created several powerful tools and applied them simultaneously. The literal rewriting of sources through type and manuscript, physical editing of artifacts, restorations to fit a desired image, the destruction of color, branding, institutional control over access, academies, collections, monopolies on the authentic, and symbolic appropriation, names, authorship, fatherhood of discoveries. These tools were not invented by the Medici or Poggio. They simply applied them with unprecedented systematicity and scale, and then described it as an awakening. This is what makes the history particularly sharp. The official history of the Renaissance was written using the same methods by which the Renaissance crafted its version of antiquity. Vasari wrote the Lives, a foundational document that we still use as a primary source, 100 years after most of the events described, precisely when most of the participants could no longer object. The Florentine miracle, local geniuses, the Middle Ages as darkness, the Renaissance as light. This is not a chronicle. It is a manifesto of the victors, written to cement the victory. Look at one detail that is often overlooked. Vasari writes about the 3 centuries of Italian art. The first is childhood, the second is youth, and the third is maturity. This is a narrative of progress, linear, directed, optimistic. Each successive generation is better than the previous one. The pinnacle is Michelangelo, a contemporary of Vasari, his patron, and, in a certain sense, the subject of his cult. This is not an art historical scheme. It is theology, providence leading to perfection. Only instead of God, the Florentine genius. Instead of the Last Judgment, Michelangelo's Last Judgment on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Every time we say, the Renaissance revived antiquity, we repeat a formula that they themselves created. This is not a description of what was. It is a description of what they needed. The question is not whether these people were geniuses. Many of them were indeed. Michelangelo, perhaps the greatest sculptor in history. Raphael, one of the most precise draftsmen humanity has ever produced. That's the reality. That's theirs. But genius and appropriation do not contradict each other. They walked side by side. An Arab scholar of the 11th century described the geometry of vision, the name in the textbook of a Florentine from the 15th century. A Persian anatomist of the 14th century created anatomical diagrams, the name in the atlas of a 16th century European. A monk in St. Gall preserved Quintilian's works. History remembers the man who made his beautiful copy. Masters in Constantinople constructed domes and cast bronze centuries before the Medici. History has transformed this experience into a barbaric tradition that the Renaissance overcame. Theophanes the Greek painted lively faces half a century before the discovery of psychological realism. Only specialists know his name. Those who kept it are forgotten. Those who claimed it for themselves are remembered. There is one detail that is often lost in the overall picture. Monk Giovanni Colovini from St. Gallen, in whose library Poggio found Quintilian, corresponded with several scholars of his time. he was known, he was cited. After the humanists declared monastic libraries to be dungeons, the name of the custodian ceased to be mentioned. In the narrative, only the one who liberated the text remained, not the one who preserved it. There is no simple answer. Should we remove Michelangelo from textbooks? No. Should we acknowledge that Alberti is a secondary thinker? No. It's not about re-evaluating assessments. It's about seeing the structure, understanding that history is not just what happened. It is what was preserved, renamed, and transmitted. With whose signature? Through whose archive? In whose interest? When you see this, you start asking different questions. Not who invented perspective, but who gained money and power from this invention. Not who discovered quintillion, but who benefited from this discovery, and when exactly. Not was Vesalius a genius, but whose knowledge did he systematize, and whose names disappeared from the atlas. When we speak of antiquity, we usually refer to what has been shown to us. White, promising, with the right hands, with the signatures of the relevant people. And what was before it was edited, that is the real question, the one for which there are no answers in textbooks. The Renaissance is not an exception in history. It is its normal flow, described in enough detail for us to see the mechanics. In other eras, the mechanics are the same. There are just fewer traces. This is indeed the most uncomfortable conclusion of this analysis. It's not about Alberti taking from Alhazen. It's not about Ligorio creating forgeries. It's the fact that the entire story we call the history of culture is organized by the same principles. Whoever rewrites the past in their favor is the one who stands at the beginning of the textbook. Take another look at the word Renaissance. Rebirth. Who coined this term? Vasari. When? 100 years after the events began. For whom? For the Medici court. Why rebirth and not appropriation, not adaptation, not synthesis? Because rebirth implies that something has died, and if it has died, then the heirs decide what to do with it. The Middle Ages were declared the Dark Ages not because there was no culture. There was a vibrant culture. Gothic cathedrals, scholastic philosophy, monastic science, icon painting. It was deemed dark so that what followed would appear as light. This is a rhetorical device, a technique that still works every time we repeat the word Renaissance. To call an era the Renaissance is to accept the version of those who coined it, to use their word, to think in their category. This is precisely the final, most enduring level of appropriation. Not a statue, not a manuscript, the word itself in our language. The next time you see this word in a textbook, in a documentary film, in a caption for a painting, take a moment. Ask, who wrote this? When? For whom? Because it's the very question that the Renaissance did not want you to ask. And that's why it is so rarely asked, even now.